So today is another life-altering day. I'm about to do a forest bathing walk. And I'm really excited, but I'm really tired. I think the blood donation is kicking my ass. So today is another possibly life-altering day. Wednesday was because I learned about the self-employment entrepreneurship program. Yesterday, so I saw a beautiful place. Today has indeed been another life-altering, trajectory-changing day, as I've designed it to be. Didn't happen by accident. I just did the forest bathing walk and it was magical and beautiful. And I realized that in the business plan I'm going to create, could definitely integrate mindful forest bathing walks into the plan. Because I remember talking with myself about the opposites of so-called psychosis. The forest and nature is definitely an opposite of that, and by immersing ourselves in some of the opposites, a lot of it falls away, so that perhaps we don't need to engage so much in the human contrivances that are designed to help us heal through some of these things. And part of the reason why we have so many abstractions and distractions in our mind is because we're not connected with nature. We don't have a relationship with nature. And nature is something so real and sane. And when we don't have a relationship with it, more unreal abstractions and thoughts can get to us. They can build up. And I do want to create something where I'm free to be in the forest. So perhaps the part, if I do anything live in person, would be in the forest. Maybe one can work from the forest. I'm finding that I need to go into the forest to decrease my allostatic load. So I could be stressed out and I could take a pill, which I haven't done in a long time, or I could go into the forest and it takes it all away. It's magic, but it's not magic. There's so much energy and immensity and electrons. And I didn't put on my earthing shoe thing. That's something I'm going to put into my magical backpack. That's something that could be in people's magical backpack, is the ability to be connected to the earth. Because when we're connected to the earth, the electrons in the earth go into our body, and then those electrons are used to reduce free radicals, which is something we take vitamins for. But by getting electrons from the earth, those are used preferentially to the vitamins, so then the vitamins can go and do something else. I introduced myself to a tree and I left one strand of my hair hanging from her bark so she can remember me and we can continue to communicate. It's really hard to leave the forest. Can you hear the sound of the maple leaves tickling each other? I forgot to bring this with me in the forest, but I'm going to add it to my magical backpack because this connects to the earth. It's rubber that is grounded and then connects to the string and then connects to the skin. So then one is connected to the earth and gets the benefits of earthing. That looks fun. I'm not sure why I went this way on this path, but I might have just found an eagle feather. I don't know if that's what it is. I'll have to consult my eagle feather consultant to know for sure. And I'm becoming aware of lifestyle design factors. I've talked about happiness first with myself and feel like part of happiness is nature. Nature is joy itself. Perhaps nature first? I got an email today from Jamie Wheel's Flow Genome Project, and they sent some interesting links, and one of them was about how new discovery might change psychiatry. And it's an article by Science Mag online, and I read it, and it's really fascinating. It talked about something that I've never heard of before, which is that serotonin acts on about 14 different receptors, and the pharmaceutical drugs that work on serotonin, particularly the SSRIs, work on receptor number 1. But the second receptor has something more to do with what psychedelics act on. And the article said that the pharmaceutical drugs act on receptor 1 and actually suppress receptor 2. And I found that fascinating. I find that a little bit too convenient. I find that to be purposeful. Because if the second receptor is the one that leads to changing context, and I can't remember how they described it, I'll have to look. So the article's called Rethinking Serotonin Could Shift Psychiatric Care, or something like that. I forget already. That's the thing with not having a second screen. And so it talks about how psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD are thought to act on receptor 2. And it says something about how current treatments promote receptor 1A activity, often suppressing 2A activity. And so the therapeutic benefit of activating 2A has been overlooked. I doubt it's been overlooked. That seems very purposeful, because it's saying that 1A helps people cope, which is getting stuck in it, coping with it, whereas 2A might have something to do with the transformative effect, because they're saying LSD, psilocybin, and psychedelics activate that activity of 2A. And of course, read the article if you want to have it exactly right, because I'm just talking about it with myself. Activating serotonin 2A may be a good thing, as it makes individuals very sensitive to context and their environment. I think this is partly what is happening in map consciousness is we are having that receptor activated because we are more sensitive to our environment and our context, which is part of how it makes us want to change our environment or our context and live a different life because we're seeing things differently. And it says this is how psychedelics work. They make people sensitive to context and open to change via activating the 2A receptor. And they say something so fascinating in the article. They say the 1A and the 2A receptors have a two-pronged approach. So serotonin acting on the 1A can help us reduce the stress of a situation and we become more resilient. But sometimes that's not enough. So then the serotonin acts on the 2A receptor, and that in extreme crisis, the 2A pathway kicks in to open up a window of plasticity in which fundamental changes in outlook and behavior can occur. Now, to me, this is exactly what's happening when one goes into transformational crisis. Maybe one has had some kind of trauma and then the stress builds up, and simply coping and being resilient in the situation isn't enough. So then serotonin can act on the 2A pathway, which changes the whole context. It opens up this window of plasticity, and that's a great way to describe it. So it's a process of exploring and learning new behaviors, completely new, and no wonder sometimes it's challenging to adapt to that. And when that window of plasticity starts closing, one gets reacquainted with old behaviors, and that can be traumatic in itself because we had access to new adaptive ways of being, and sometimes those retreat and recede from our possibilities, as maybe that 2A receptor pathway is starting to not be active anymore. It seems like more of an emergency. One needs to change one's behaviors or will no longer be in existence. It's really fascinating. I really like that article. I'm going to print it off. Makes a lot of sense. And that's the thing too, it makes sense with what I've been talking about with myself, and that's usually what happens is I'm talking with myself about something and then I find something confirming it in what is reaching out to me or what I reach out to, is that taking some kind of med can help one cope with a crappy situation. So it's making one able to cope and resilient and keep the situation mostly the same. And so if one starts to take micronutrients or something and the situation stays the same, then all the nutrients are going to help one cope and be resilient. And there's another aspect, which is this window of plasticity, this opening up to new ways of looking and new ways of being and new behavior. So in my mind, if that pathway opens up in map consciousness of having new outlooks and new behaviors, new manic or magic traits, when one switches to micronutrients or whatever, one still needs to participate in lifestyle design, in changing one's epigenetic matrix. And I just realized there could be an epiperceptual matrix, which is new ways of seeing, which changes the ways of behavior. So there's a perceptual matrix related to the epigenetic matrix, which is playing with new perceptions, creating new perceptions, and creating new gestures and behaviors. So instead of having access to, say, 100 gestures, maybe now we have access to 10,000. And it's up to us, because that can become overwhelming, it's up to us to prune out in the lifestyle design process. And that's why I feel like lifestyle design goes hand in hand with this, because it's not about creating new gestures to do those gestures alone in one's room in a basement suite. It's to go out and interface with actuality. So that's changing the environment too. So being in this environment in nature right now as I am, I found a stump to sit on. Acts like a chair. I found perhaps an eagle feather, maybe a different kind of feather, and it changes the epigesturetic matrix. It changes the epi-perceptual matrix, what I'm able to see, the subtleties, the beauty, the creativity of nature, and how this energy changes me, it changes my brain fundamentally. So if that second serotonin pathway, the 2A pathway, is to change outlook and behavior, and we have this mechanism within us that doesn't require meds, but sometimes it gets activated in, say, so-called mania, changes our perception, our outlook, our behavior. Even when that process ends and we end up medicated or something, and then years later discover something like micronutrients, we can still co-create and participate in designing new perceptions and gestures. Perceptions, outlook. Behavior, gestures. So there's a perceptual gesturetic matrix. If we can see differently, we're going to gesture differently. We do different gestures in a forest than we do in a city. We do very limited gestures by ourselves, isolated in a room. And it seems like after some kind of crisis, where say we have a habitual life, we have a routine, then there's some kind of crisis that comes in and shows us that we can't keep going like that because there was trauma within what we thought was safety of our habits and routines. So then it could lead to us feeling like we need to create a new kind of life that's not safe anymore, that little habitual thing. So that's complicated. I don't want to go into that per se, but I can see this epi-perceptual gesturetic matrix. I like the word perception and gesture better than outlook and behavior, because an outlook sounds like it's something that continues in time for a long period of time. Like, oh, I changed my outlook and now I'm going to cling on to that and keep that for the next 10 years. And behaviors sound like, oh, that's that person's behaviors, that's how they are. There's this behavior, that behavior. And behavior sounds like something we've already predetermined in society, like bad behavior and good behavior and what falls in each category, whereas gestures are micro behaviors. It can be something so small, like a gesture is a smile. You wouldn't call smiling or a smile a behavior. Oh, they have the behavior of smiling. But we can break it down even further into little tiny gestures, and when we're moving at the level of micro gestures, then we're not extending that into this long pattern of a so-called behavior that a self is doing. Because a gesture is related to perception. I perceive someone walking by, I smile, it's over. Whereas a behavior is more of this long pattern carried out by a self. Whereas a perception gesture is a response, an action congruent with the moment. So, for example, if I'm not on the path of my light body self, and I'm feeling the stress of that, and I'm working in some kind of meaningless job, then I'm going to maybe have this long, drawn-out behavior ritual of going through McDonald's drive-thru every day. So that's a behavior. It's a pattern. It's in response to the stress of not living out one's truth. Whereas a small gesture in the moment isn't that. So yeah, I don't know what I'm saying exactly, but I can kind of see something. The more I gesture towards nature, the more I might create a behavior, a supposed behavior of being in the forest. So yeah, that's a great article. And I don't have the greatest Wi-Fi connection here, so I need to find out if I can find one that will upload some of this to the cloud so I have more space. Otherwise, I should probably switch to audio. This might mean I'm officially shamanic, humanic. Calling to the ocean animals. Maybe they can hear the love whistling through the water. I also created an update of my side-by-side photo and made it a side-by-side because the third one is completely medication free. Is this a good idea? Nature mysticism for mental health. Can micronutrients help us reconnect with nature? Reconnect with something actual? I was listening to myself talk about the window of plasticity in the Science Mag online article, and it made me think of how hallucinations, so-called hallucinations and delusions, are really new plasticity of soundscape and sightscape. Instead of having the same thoughts looping in one's head over and over all day long, and those participating in projecting so-called perceptions. Most of our perceptions are projections of these inner soundscapes and inner images. So when we go into map consciousness, we have not a window of plasticity, but a whole soundscape and sightscape and visionscape of plasticity. It all becomes plastic as our brains become neurofluid. So it would be more of a fluidity of soundscapes and sightscapes, and one of the reasons is because we're seeing new, we're seeing fresh without our inner projections. So then seeing new produces inner sounds that are new, which we've never heard before, which we might associate and feel like we're hearing it in somebody else's voice. And it can turn into feeling like that is very true when we're not understanding this process, this fluidity of soundscapes and perceptionscapes. We go from deceptionscapes of our inner thoughts, the ones that are programmed and conditioned and congealed in our brain, to fluid, new, creative perceptionscapes and soundscapes and insightscapes as opposed to thoughtscapes. And we reach escape velocity from the atrocity of our conditioning.